On this episode of China Unscripted, the world is running out of time. We must decouple with China before they decouple with us. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
The U.S. and China are at war. It isn't a kinetic war, but it is an ideological war. And unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party is kind of kicking our butts. We're going to get into a story about how China is working to decouple with the U.S., which could have devastating consequences for the United States. But first, since this is an ideological battle, and I don't think a lot of people really understand this, I think we should take a look at how the Chinese Communist Party celebrated its 100th birthday. I mean, have you seen some of those, the celebration they did? It was extreme cult-like behavior.
Yeah, well, the Chinese Communist Party is basically the world's most powerful cult.
It's a good way to put it.
I mean, look, they are a cult. They force you to believe their ideology. It's very difficult to leave. Once you become a member, you have to pledge your life to the flag, essentially. You have to pledge yourself to the party. You also have to pay some amount of membership dues. So they're taking your money. They have a possibly charismatic leader that you have to follow. You can't stray ideologically or they punish you. They have their own system of punishment, the shuanggui, which they do to party members, which is outside the normal legal system. Just like, and then, of course, all of the other things that they do to people. But like, those are pretty cult-like things, not to mention those creepy photos from July 1st.
Yeah, but I don't think that, like I don't really like using the word cult for this because I think that just an exaggeration of what people experience on the ground in a lot of ways in terms of joining the Communist Party, because for most people, they think of it as basically when Jack Posobiec was on last week, we talked about how it was like the 1% of China, the party members. So they see it as a way of just getting up in the world. Like if you want to get a raise or a promotion at your company, you have to join the party. Or maybe if you want to get into a good, PhD program, you should join the party.
I think this is really key to kind of what I was saying at the beginning about how this is an ideological war with the U.S. For many years, the Chinese Communist Party had to, in a way, play nice to lure in Western democracies to work with it, especially in the years after the Tiananmen Square massacre. There was a lot of suspicion.
I just think that this is how most people kind of experience it. So they have to pay dues, but a lot of people just don't pay dues anymore. And then the Communist Party doesn't count them as having left the party. But
so it's a party you can never leave.
But they essentially are not really part of it. Or, for example, But
they have pledged to live and die for the party. Like that pledge doesn't just go away.
So, okay, like I get where you're coming from. And I think the other thing that's sort of in favor of your argument is that the word cult is an ill-defined term. And it's mainly used as like a kind of general description of something that you don't like. So I get that. And yeah, there's like a, sliding scale of what's a cult versus what's a religion. Certainly you would agree, Shelley, that the Chinese Communist Party essentially has created a religion, right?
I mean, they've basically they supplanted religions in China, essentially.
Right, but the Communist Party has its own ideological system of beliefs, right?
Yeah, and I think they've used increasingly religious language. This is kind of the point I was trying to make about the cult thing, that even from after Mao died and up until, the last few years, people joined the party because of just kind of like a personal interest type of thing, not because they thought that they really believed in communism, etc. It's like you joined something thinking it wasn't for real, but now it's for real. Do you know what I mean? Now it's kind of taking on the religious, or, when Xi Jinping says that you have to go to on a pilgrimage to Yan'an, where the party, had its base for many years, and it's a spiritual experience, or, they're kind of increasingly using that, or when you have increasing things like churches in China having to put up pictures of Mao and Xi Jinping, so it's kind of, I would say it's moving increasingly in that direction, but I think a lot of people wouldn't have experienced it that way up until very recently.
So is it more like the Mao Zedong days now than it was under, say, Deng Xiaoping or Jiang Zemin?
I think the party's always been there, but people didn't really take it seriously for a long time in terms of you had to go to take your Marxist-Leninist class at school, right? And everybody just did it. But nobody really thought that this is something we have to take seriously. But now, Xi Jinping has been very clear that what he doesn't want to do is become Gorbachev. Like, he's not really willing to put the party's power at risk.
You're saying Xi Jinping essentially now wants ideological purity among party members.
He's bringing the ideology back to the forefront in a way that it hasn't been.
I think this is really key to kind of what I was saying at the beginning about how this is an ideological war with the U.S. For many years, the Chinese Communist Party had to, in a way, play nice to lure in Western democracies to work with it, especially in the years after the Tiananmen Square massacre. There was a lot of suspicion about what kind of regime it was. But now what we've seen is the party has gained so much power and influence and feels like they can do anything and Wall Street will be on their side. We've seen now that they can kind of show their true face, which is what the party has always been.
It's interesting that the party tries to both claim, we've been around for 100 years, look at how great we are, and at the same time just try to ignore all the things like the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. It's like we are the same party, but also we didn't do any of those things.
And also not a whole lot of mention of how it was actually started by agents from the Soviet Union.
Oh, well, because Mao
third
purged
commentary.
those people way back in the, during the Yan'an rectification.
Right. I mean, no mention of essentially the Chinese Communist Party being a foreign, like having a foreign origin, right? I mean, it's essentially Marxist-Leninist, which is itself Western and foreign, but also it was the Soviet Union's third Comintern that, came to China through its Far East Bureau and attempted to start the Chinese version of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which then Mao, he kind of like took that to be his own thing and purged the Soviets eventually. But like that's the origin of the party, which is not really something they want to talk about.
I mean, that's the beauty of socialism with Chinese characteristics, is that they can kind of claim the legacy of, this Marxist party, but also claim the legacy of China and the 5,000 years of history, which they, of course, tried to destroy many times under their 100 years of existence. But let's forget about that part, So it's like they want to be both this powerful party that's lasted for 100 years, but they also want to claim that they're not the same party that they were in the 50s and the 60s, in the 80s, even though they have never, repudiated any of those things that they've done.
Well, it's not even so much that they're claiming they're not that party anymore. It's just any of the bad things that happened back then, that didn't happen. So it's always been the same great party leading China to a new future, protecting the Chinese people from the Westerners who want to enslave the Chinese people. And that was a point Xi Jinping made in his big speech at the 100-year anniversary. He was saying anyone who wants to oppress or enslave China will have their heads bloodied, something like that.
I don't think it
Smashed
was
against
even
the Great Wall of Steel forged by 1.4 billion Chinese people.
Beautiful word.
flesh and blood.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because he's using like the language of like, obviously anyone who's trying to enslave China, like that's not good. That's not really what he's talking about. He's talking about this ideological war with the United States. And that encompasses things like U.S. boycotts of Xinjiang cotton because Xinjiang cotton is made with ethnic slave labor.
Yeah, I mean, I think it wasn't just about enslaving Chinese people, because
He said like oppress, enslave,
it was
Bully.
bully.
So the bully part, I think, is important because, a lot of countries talk about, we won't be slaves or whatever. But the bully part is the type of propaganda that the Chinese Communist Party uses to basically claim that anytime anybody stands up to them or rejects something that they want to do, that is bullying China, right?
And this ties into what you were saying about like the patriotic education that happened after the Tiananmen Square massacre. Now, you said that, the young people going to these Marxist-Leninist class, they don't really believe in communism. They don't really believe in the party. But that was not the focus of that. That was to implant this kind of ideology that you're talking about, where they are primed to be triggered by that language. Oh, yeah, we don't want to be bullied by foreign powers. The Communist Party is there to defend us from these Western bullies. So even though they might not be, waving around their little Maoist red books, they still have been implanted with this communist ideology that can be triggered very easily.
I mean, that was the point of the patriotic education and the whole turn towards socialism with Chinese characteristics, because once they started becoming, everything was different from other Marxist-Leninist states, and the collapse of the Soviet Union meant that the collapse of communism in most of the world meant that they couldn't really draw on that strength anymore, so they had to kind of change it to be something else that they could. It's kind of like what North Korea did with Juche in a way.
Yeah.
Where they took Marxist-Leninist thought and then were like, okay, we're not Marxist-Leninist anymore. Now we're self-reliant. Is that the... Like, it's not self-reliant. It's something similar to that.
But their Juche system is essentially a Marxist-Leninist communist ideology with like a little bit of rebranding, with a few things borrowed from the Christian Bible to prop up Kim Il-sung and how he poops rainbows or whatever. And then
I think the thing is he doesn't
poop.
Yeah.
But there were rainbows when he was born, something like this.
We're getting some of the details of Juche ideology mixed up here.
Well, but anyway, the point is that they just call it a different thing, and then it's their own thing.
Well, this ties back into postmodernism in general, which is kind of a lot of where communism is coming from. There are no actual hard and fast definitions to things. Things can be whatever you want them to be, and that's been very effective in how, I know you've talked about this a lot, Shelley, how the Chinese Communist Party can manipulate language to be whatever it wants, to serve whatever needs it has.
Right, so I call myself a nice guy, and I can define nice however I want.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly. Well, so for the celebration of the 100-year anniversary, the Chinese Communist Party released a white paper on human rights, and it said they have the best human rights.
Yeah, because everybody's universal human rights are definitely universal, but every country interprets them in a different way.
Yeah, that was how they
right.
did it. And they defined it as like subsistence, and I forget the other word.
Development.
Development, economic development. So as long as the party lifts people out of poverty, no mention of how they kind of changed the definition of poverty, as long as that's the case, then they're providing the best human rights, because also they're providing human rights to more people because they have a fifth of the world's population.
I'm really glad we now have the podcast on video on YouTube so people can see the quotation marks that you just did.
Can't people hear the quotation marks? Well, no, it's like, human rights or human rights. The second one had quotation marks around it.
Okay, yeah.
But at any rate, yeah, so that definition, like no other country can have better human rights, because if China provides it to a fifth of the world's population, then no country can be more than that, because no country has a bigger population.
And this is a great example of why the Chinese Communist Party is in an ideological war with the United States. Essentially what the Chinese Communist Party is saying is, we have our definition of human rights. You can have yours. Just don't force your values on us. And to a lot of people, that sounds reasonable. You don't want, other cultures, other people forcing their beliefs on you. But if you look at what's happening to the Uyghurs, that's evil. If you look at the organ harvesting of Falun Gong, that's evil. Everything the Chinese Communist Party has done in the past 100 years to the Chinese people is evil. And this is why the United States is such a threat to the Chinese Communist Party, because in the foundation upon which the United States is built on is the idea that human rights are not something meted out by committee. They are inalienable rights that are bestowed, that are a fundamental part of human existence given by the creator or nature. These are the words the founding father are using, but that they are something transcendent, not something that a government can choose to give or not to give. And this is the biggest threat to the Chinese Communist Party, that there are unchangeable truths.
Well, we may hold these truths to be self-evident, but I don't think the Chinese Communist Party sees them as self-evident because they believe ideologically that rights come from them.
In the Chinese Constitution, it's essentially that you have these rights as long as they don't go against the interests of the state.
Right. I mean, I think, you bring up the U.S. founding fathers and this idea that rights come from the creator, right? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Also, it's interesting the context in which the Declaration of Independence was written, right? It's like you had a sort of elite group of intelligent, well-educated men in the American colonies. And, okay, you're giving me that look because, yes, there's some things that are problematic and some of them were slave owners. But that's true. That's not the direction I want to go in. But the point is that they were these very intelligent, educated men who were feeling that they were oppressed by an even greater, eliter, more powerful group, which was the British king, the English king.
The group that was the English king.
That's why they say we.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so.
Okay, well, I understand. It actually was Parliament, but they, for political reasons, didn't want to say it.
Okay. Thank you for being accuracy ninja. The point is that you had people who had this ability to create a new system who were themselves feeling this sort of yoke of oppression. And so that's kind of where their whole rights can't be given by the crown or by the king or by parliament, right? Rights come from the creator and thereby are able to sort of define what human rights or rights ought to be, because they weren't people in power. Because people in power typically are I'm happy to give you some rights, but they're from me. And so you now had rights being defined by people who were not in power. And by not being in power, they were representing the vast majority of people in a way that people in power are never representing the vast majority of people.
That is the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The French Revolution was basically a proto-communist revolution where everything still came from the state. I don't know if the state is the right word for that, what that revolution put into power. But it is also a fundamental difference between how the United States looks at human rights and pretty much every other country on the planet. Most European countries, they don't look at it like this. They talk about human rights, they talk about freedom of speech, but it's still not something, they don't talk about it as if it's a transcendent, inalienable thing.
Well,
Right.
I don't know if that's true because essentially I think you would have British people, for example, talking about how the Magna Carta was essentially, in a lot of ways, that for them.
The Magna Carta was the first type of restriction on
The absolute
power of the monarch.
Yeah. But I mean, France, for example, has freedom of speech. I'm using quotes again.
Mm-hmm. For everyone listening on podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify.
So while France has freedom of speech, it's also in a little bit like China in that your freedom of speech is only guaranteed insofar as you don't infringe on national interests, right? And so after the Yellow Vest protests a couple of years ago, the French police arrested thousands of people for protesting and charged them because they can do that under French law, right? Whereas in the U.S., no matter what horrible things you might say about the government or the most obscene, terrible things you say in a protest, you still have actual freedom of speech as long as you're not, violent, for example. And so the U.S. could have never done to completely peaceful protesters what the French government was easily able to do under their own laws, which is to say France is less free than the United States.
Similar restrictions exist in Germany. New Zealand is a great example of this. New Zealand.
Well, they have like a
classification office, and the head of that is called the chief censor.
Yeah.
So, the American view on human rights is unique in the world, which I think is one of the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party is so invested in an ideological war against the U.S. In particular, because I feel it is this American ideology that has made the U.S. so successful. It has created a system of prosperity for the world that is a challenge to the Chinese Communist Party model, which is why we see the Communist Party trying to develop this alternative system to supplant what the United States has created.
I mean, I don't think they could have done it, essentially, until now. They always did not like relying on the U.S. or Western systems, but they basically made a calculation that they couldn't really go up against it, economically especially.
Mm-hmm. Before the podcast began, you were telling us about Didi, this ride-sharing service thing in China. I think that's a really good example of, it's a specific example of how China is beginning to develop this alternative system. We've talked before about how as long as the Chinese Communist Party relies on U.S. dollars, they are vulnerable to U.S. sanctions, so they're trying to create their own model of yuan or digital yuan. But I think this investment is a very good example.
Well, there are a few things going on with Didi that are complicated. So essentially what happened is that Didi...
So Shelley, what's Didi?
I was just about to go into that before you interrupted me. Thank you.
Hey, I identify as nice.
So Didi is a ride-sharing app, kind of like the Uber of China, you could say.
Could you define to us what Uber is?
Thank you for being on my side.
I don't know if that was being on your side.
I had no particular motive behind that statement.
All right. Well, there's three of us, so two of us have to gang up on the other person.
That's true. That's communism. You know, a train of thought can be easily derailed. That's why you should hail a cab through Didi, China's #1 ride-sharing
You can't
app.
do it right now because they've taken them off all the app stores.
It's a fascinating story. Tell me more.
Okay, so Didi was the Uber of China, and a couple weeks ago they had a successful IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, raised $4.4 billion. And, you know, they're basically the biggest ride-sharing app in China, so everybody was like, okay, this is great, we can make a lot of money. And then suddenly the regulator, the Chinese state regulator, last week decided to pull the app from all the app stores in China. Basically, they said that Didi had some problems with their data management. And so then they lost something like $15 billion on the stock exchange after that happened.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
You know what I wonder is, so a lot of Westerners invested in this, and then their money disappeared, but it didn't necessarily disappear. I wonder who short sold the stock before the regulators made their decision.
Oh, I'm getting GameStop vibes.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, because Didi, like all other companies in China, is at the whims of a small number of extremely powerful bureaucrats or regulators in this case. So is it, I mean, I don't know what happened, but like the regulators had to know that as soon as they made this decision, it was going to plunge the stock price after this recent IPO, right?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things going on here. One thing is that it's not clear why the Chinese regulators suddenly did this to Didi. One thing is that apparently before they had even done their IPO, that the state regulator kept asking them to take off sensitive locations from their mapping. Because every rideshare app, you can see where you're going, whatever. They were concerned that when Didi IPO'd, then that data could be seen by, foreign governments, essentially. So you don't want, sensitive military installations or, concentration camps. There might be certain sensitive information that the Chinese Communist Party did not want Didi to have in its IPO. The other thing is that they're trying to crack down on tech companies in general, and especially companies that are IPOing in the US or other countries. So they don't really want these companies going out to get foreign investment in New York or in London anymore, which is the way that a lot of Chinese companies have been doing it for years.
That's a big change.
Yes. So, for a long time, this was a great win-win for Chinese companies and the Chinese Communist Party, because these companies would come abroad, get a lot of foreign investment, and then that money goes into China.
Particularly
right?
U.S. dollars, yeah.
Yeah, and the party relies on U.S. dollars to manage their monetary system.
And they don't like that.
But I think what's happening now is that with this wider crackdown on companies that are IPOing in the U.S., essentially it's a signal from the state that they don't really want companies doing this anymore. Maybe they prefer companies to IPO in Shanghai or Hong Kong. And therefore, it's a way of decoupling with the U.S. because they essentially believe now that there's enough interest from foreign investors that the foreign investors will happily come to China instead.
And this is big because in the Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about the U.S. decoupling from the Chinese economy. The Chinese Communist Party hated that idea. They frequently said how bad that idea would be. However, they don't want the U.S. to decouple from China, but they would love if China could decouple from the U.S. And those are different things.
Yeah, so the Chinese way of decoupling with the U.S. would be, well, we're not going to bring our companies to the New York Stock Exchange so you guys can make money here. You're going to have to come to China and do your business in yuan.
Wasn't that what that Chinese professor was saying?
Yeah, basically. I mean, it's not like he was an especially high up person. I think he just gave some accurate analysis.
Had his finger on the pulse.
And, this is something we see with, companies like BlackRock going into China now and being told, well, you can set up your mutual funds here and you don't need to have a, Chinese partner company anymore. Citi, Merrill, a lot of these companies, financial companies are being told, well, now you can come into China.
Which is why this is such a dangerous but hopeful time right now. The Chinese Communist Party, in this ideological war, is trying to create this separate system that will then dominate and overpower the liberal world order we have now. Eventually, we will be unable to fight that system.
Yeah, as soon as they can basically get off the dollar, then, for example, sanctions against Chinese officials for human rights violations, for genocide, won't work anymore.
It would mean as much as China sanctioning Ted Cruz right now. Which they did. And Ted Cruz is like, I'm not going to Shanghai.
So it doesn't really matter. I don't have any money that goes anywhere near China. So that's what they're trying essentially to do. And you mentioned Xi Jinping's speech earlier in the podcast, and we were all talking about the whole, bloodied heads against that Great Wall of Steel. And I think a lot of people hyper focused on that because it was violent imagery. But in the rest of his speech, a lot of what he was talking about was this idea that China is going to decouple from the rest of the world, that we need to depend on ourselves. We need to grow our self-reliance in China, our businesses. He talked about all of this stuff in that speech. And it's not the first time that he's explicitly said this. He said this when last year when they were coming up with the 5-year plan that, we are going to essentially, he said, we need to decrease our dependency on other countries while also making other countries more dependent on us for, manufacturing and things like that. He was talking about decreasing the dependence on, natural resources from other countries, that kind of thing. He doesn't want China to rely on Australian, iron ore to make steel, that kind of stuff. But he wants Australia to have to come to China to buy electronics.
And this actually segues really nicely into the other big news item recently, China's space ambitions. Recently, China just completed its first manned spacewalk. It successfully sent 3 astronauts to the beginnings of their space station, what they will call an international space station.
The Tiangong.
Heavenly Palace. Beautiful. And so this ideological war is even extending into space. The Chinese Communist Party is trying to dominate space, and if it does, it will be able to deny access to anyone that doesn't play by the party's rules. Already, they are developing space weapons that can blind U.S. satellites, which, if that happens, say goodbye to GPS. That would not only hurt Uber, which is the American version of Didi, for those who don't know.
Well, I think actually,
as well as military GPS.
You joke, but as soon as it becomes like that, that's a sign that,
that's right,
that they've won the war. That, like, if we start referring to Google as the Chinese version of Baidu, or the American version of Baidu, or whatever, right?
Twitter, America's version of Weibo.
But if they destroy the American GPS system, there's always China's competing system,
exactly,
which is called the
Beidou.
Beidou, yeah.
Which they only finished everything last year. Like, they launched the last satellite
just in time for us to all switch over to their system.
But this is really a huge threat. China is teaming up with Russia. Last space race was U.S. versus Russia. Now it's going to be U.S. versus Russia and China. It's already not so good. And China and Russia are working to be the first to build a moon base, be the first to have an orbiting station around the moon.
Remember when Newt Gingrich ran for president back in 2012?
He was a prophet.
And he wanted to build a moon base, and everybody was like, this guy is so nuts,
And it really is a shame, because America's enemies were not joking around with this. We are in a very dangerous situation if Russia and China control space. Space warfare is essentially already here.
Yeah, I think that people think of, Star Wars or something. When you think space warfare, you think of like pew, pew, pew in space, but that's not really what you're talking about.
In space, no one can hear you pew, pew, pew.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. But also, like, if you look at what the U.S. Space Force is, like, it's not a force in space the way the Navy is a force in the seas. It is a force that is almost exclusively on the ground on Earth, but is doing a whole bunch of things related to objects in space, or like, robotic or, smart objects in space, satellites and whatnot. And yes, we'll eventually have spacecraft, but that's perhaps quite a long ways out.
And this is a good distinction, too, because most of America's space activity has been done by NASA, which is a civilian agency, or more recently, private companies like SpaceX. China, their space program is run by the People's Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party itself.
Yeah, that's a little scary.
It shows you the difference. Like, this is China's space activities are a military operation.
Well, I mean, to a degree, the Communist Party considers everything a military operation, including its private companies, with quotation marks, operating around the world, like Huawei, for example.
Yeah, they call it civil-military fusion. Everything, and this goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning of the podcast, everything is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And by extension, it's military.
It's like, every time there's some new law that Congress in the U.S. is considering, like a surveillance law or something like that, there's always people in Congress who are like, I don't think the government should have that much power, right? And, in China, every time there's something that they want to do that's going to give the Communist Party more power, like, okay, they just take it.
I was just thinking about how the problem here is that so much of the world just doesn't understand this about the Chinese Communist Party, about the Chinese regime.
I think it's kind of taboo to even mention ideological conflicts in this day and age.
Yeah, because it feels like we're over that. That's so 1960s.
Yeah, everyone has their different values. The U.S. shouldn't force its values on China.
Well, I wasn't even thinking about that part of it. I was
think it's
thinking
tied
about
into it.
that's tied into it, but I was just thinking about the whole like, oh, we don't want to call it a
Cold
Cold War
Wars, yeah.
because that's just not like there's something distasteful about using that
We're
term.
more civilized. We're at the end of history now. We're above that.
And
But if we're not careful, we will be at the end of history.
Yep.
well, I was thinking about this guy we wrote about for headlines, Ian Lipkin, the Columbia University
Yeah.
professor, who he had been one of the signers of that opinion piece in Nature Medicine that was saying that, oh, well, there's probably no way that this could have come from the coronavirus could come from a lab. And then, it turns out that he has all of these ties with the Chinese Communist Party because
He got the top award for foreign scientists at a ceremony presided over by Xi Jinping. He got an award from Dr. Shi Zhengli, the bat woman, the one who was doing coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. She gave him an award.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the thing, right? If you treat China like it's just a normal country, just like France or the UK, what struck me about looking at the stuff about Lipkin is that Columbia University splashed this information as press releases, right? They were like, oh, yes, China is honoring one of our professors with the top scientific medal presided by over by Xi Jinping. Or, China is awarding him, he got another medal last year that was commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party's rule over China. And it was done at the Chinese consulate, like the consul general gave him the award, all this, this fancy stuff. And so if it is the UK or France or whatever, you're like, oh yeah, that is really prestigious, right? But then that award that he got last year was partially given by the Central Military Commission.
Mm-hmm.
It's just these things that, if you treat China like a normal country, like, oh yeah, that's great that he got these awards. If you treat them like a authoritarian regime that's committing genocide, it's like, do you really want to be splashing that all over the front page of your university that like your professor got an award from a country that's committing genocide?
It makes me think of, recently we had Youngmi Park, the North Korean defector, on, and she was sharing with us her experience at Columbia University and how this kind of woke ideology has taken over the school. And it can have massive foreign policy effects.
Well, in a generation when like the national leadership is all like graduating from these Ivy League universities and they're coming to government with whatever the ideology they learned in university.
Or even right now, like this kind of ideology could make, the leadership at the school feel more comfortable with China, that the Chinese Communist Party is doing good things or whatever. And so now you have a professor with really disturbing ties to the Chinese Communist Party actively arguing against a lab leak hypothesis, making it so no one can talk about that that's just a fringe conspiracy theory. That's already having a huge impact.
I mean, I'm not even saying that he's necessarily doing this out of some kind of because he's a stooge for the Communist Party or anything like that. It's just that he started working in China after the SARS outbreak in 2003. And so, he worked with all these scientists and I'm sure they did some good things in terms of like, building, a better pandemic response system in China or whatever. But then it would have worked great if
it had been designed in a way that didn't rely on the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, what happened was that people were afraid in Wuhan to report it. Right.
Right.
This is one of those stories that we've kind of forgot about. Yeah. The design, it wasn't the design of the system. It was that the system was also under a communist system where nobody wants to be the first to give bad news because then you get responsible and you get in trouble for it.
Yeah. They designed a system that would have worked in the US.
Right.
But it's because nobody understands the ideological difference of the Chinese Communist.
Well, it's like you can design a building that's a great building, but if you build it on a sand dune, it's not going to work as intended.
Well, my point here was more that, from this guy's perspective, it's not necessarily that he was bought off by the CCP I mean, some people are, but not everybody needs to
I'm
be.
sure he thinks he's independent and very, very smart.
And, doing a good thing, right? Like working with scientists in China to prevent global panic. Like this
It's
is
the failure to recognize that the Chinese Communist Party is fundamentally evil, and it's a failure to recognize this ideological battle that is happening.
But this is what happens to a lot of people.
Yes, that's why we're not doing so well.
This is what happens where you kind of go to China and it's, these great, beautiful skyscrapers and the high-speed trains and, you see everything is going so wonderfully and they're like, oh, you can come be a guest lecturer at our university. We're looking for more prestigious scientists to work with us.
The Chinese Communist Party is very good at playing on the
egos
of the elites.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't even have to be people who are elite. Like
who think they are.
I know people who they understand what's happening in China because they're friends with me and they know what's happening, right? But they've gone to China and there's still a little bit of that, when they talk about their trip there, even though they weren't kind of wined and dined at 5-star restaurants, they still have a little bit of that, like, oh, Shanghai,
Mm-hmm.
even though they know that there are huge, massive human rights problems. There's something that's kind of a little bit blinding about seeing that.
They're blinded by the lights. But I can see that. And it's also part of the whole, what the Communist Party does for tourists, and increasingly so, is if you go to visit China on business or as a tourist, like they will always steer you towards certain things that are designed for you to see. So Beijing and Shanghai and a few other cities are all kind of designed this way. And it's increasingly difficult to just like go off somewhere and see other parts of China that are just like not so good.
And this is the real risk, because if people fail to recognize this ideological war now, it won't be long before the Chinese Communist Party can supplant the U.S. As we were saying, if it has its own capabilities in space, its own economic system that's self-sustaining. And then, very quickly, we will come to realize the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party.
I mean, they've been telling us all along. We just kind of don't pay attention to that part.
Yeah.
It's like we believe them when they say, give us money and it'll help us reform, but we don't believe them when they say actually true things like, we are going to invade Taiwan. We are going to decouple. We are going to take over this, we're going to dominate technology and innovation and manufacturing. Like, why are we not listening to the true things they say, and instead we're listening to all the lies they tell us?
I mean, also they say those things pretty directly, but there's the other stuff that they say about, the shared future of mankind, win-win cooperation. It's all kind of with that type of language.
You're right. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
You're right. You know what? Let me retract what I said. I think we should just try to establish a win-win mutual cooperation with China.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll help them, adopt our values.
If only we had a time machine.
To assassinate Marx?
No, I don't think that ever works.
The time travel.
What would you want to use the time machine for?
You should assassinate Rousseau. He started a lot of this.
No,
I see you've been talking to Josh again.
What?
I've been reading, Shelley. I have some literature you should read.
It's like if you had an actual working time machine, is that what you do? You go back and assassinate someone?
No, I was actually just thinking about going back to the 90s and stopping them from, I wasn't even thinking that far back.
I was thinking about going back to the 90s and getting one of the original Tamagotchis.
They have an app on the phone now.
Oh, that's okay.
It's not quite the same. But yeah, no, I was thinking about the whole World Trade Organization,
yeah,
most favored nation trading status stuff.
Remember how during that time it was the far left in the US protesting against the WTO, and they're like, it's going to take American jobs and hurt American workers. And then Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party were like, no, that's too extreme. It's going to be fine. Let's work with China. And then when Donald Trump says pretty similar things, albeit with a different tone, about China taking American jobs, it's suddenly like he's off his rocker.
Racist and xenophobic.
I mean, not to defend some of the ways in which Trump said things, which aren't exactly phrased diplomatically, to say the least. But at the core of it, like the people who are opposed, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, the people who are opposed to doing more trade with China were right all along. And they've just been poo-pooed all along because there are certain interests in the U.S., namely Wall Street types and other elite types tied to Wall Street, that just want this trade and this, opportunity, irrespective of what it does to our value system or our own American economy in the long term.
And the sad thing is they are ultimately useful idiots. The Chinese Communist Party will present them with the idea of oh yeah, you will also get to be the elite. This is kind of like what we were talking about with Jack Posobiec the other week, how to these guys, to the Bloombergs or the Elon Musks, life is a game of Sim City. And they love going to China and talking about the infrastructure. And oh yeah, I can put a nuclear plant here and a highway here, just like Sim City. And you never have to worry about the stupid little Sims who you bulldoze their houses to make things over. But at the end of the day, the Wall Street types, if the Chinese Communist Party is successful at establishing what it's very close to establishing, the Wall Street types aren't going to be in charge. They aren't going to be making money. They're going to lose everything.
I mean, they already have successfully throughout many, many industries.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that, first of all, people are embarrassed about this. So when it happens, nobody talks about it. Like when they take over all of the solar panel manufacturing, or they take over the wind turbine manufacturing.
This is something we spoke to a couple of years ago with a cybersecurity expert, that most companies have been hacked by China, but they don't make it public because it's embarrassing. It'll hurt the stocks, and it'll get their CEOs or whatever fired because the shareholders will be upset.
Yeah, so it's industry after industry goes into China and loses everything, and then nobody gets in trouble for it. Manufacturing goes, then, pharmaceutical companies, Hollywood, just industry after industry. Now finance is, Hollywood was the last big one, and now finance is the new one that's going in. We talked about BlackRock, Merrill Lynch, Citi, all of these companies.
The good thing is that when these giant companies like Citigroup go into China and lose tons of people's money,
it's not their money.
It's not their money. And also, they're too big to fail, so the government will just bail them out through, printing money or using taxpayer dollars. So that's kind of solves that problem, Shelley.
Well, the nice thing about an ideological war is that, when people become aware of it, that's already a huge step in the war. Because what we don't want is a kinetic war. Actual, guns being fired, bombs going off. And the best protection from a kinetic war is the ability of the United States to have deterrence. But that requires the United States to still have power, to have a strong military, to have financial systems intact, to prevent China from creating its own system that is cushioned from anything the United States can do. So the further this goes, the weaker U.S. deterrence gets. And the weaker U.S. deterrence gets, closer to kinetic war we will actually get to. Taiwan will suffer first for this.
Right. Well, so you're arguing that the best way to stop kinetic war with China is for the U.S. to be so prepared for kinetic war that it acts as a deterrent, right?
It's very similar to how the U.S. dealt with the Soviets.
Right. So let's now map that onto everything else that China is currently at war with the U.S. over, whether it's, drug warfare, media warfare, legal warfare, and so on, right? If the U.S. could be robust enough in its own systems, then that would act as a deterrent to stop China from taking over. So manufacturing, for example, the Communist Party sees itself in a sort of trade and manufacturing war with the United States. And they actually view it as this warfare. And so if America can have its own system of manufacturing robust enough, then that's a deterrent for China to be able to use it for anything, because they just can't. And so now map that onto like everything else.
Just a
that was
quick
given to
for
China.
example for that point. At the start of the coronavirus outbreak, the U.S. doesn't manufacture any PPEs anymore.
Oh, yeah. I want to talk about this.
And so at the start of the outbreak, China told the U.S., told the Trump administration, don't talk about the origin of the coronavirus. Otherwise, we're going to cut you off from getting PPEs. And that would have cost American lives.
Right. But like, you could say, oh, America had no way of knowing that like PPE was going to be a thing in 2020 that we would need to have manufactured in the U.S.
But they could have, actually.
Well, they could have, but my point is that there's a whole bunch of things that we've offshored to China, whether it's manufacturing or just even other things, printing books and so on.
Hey, maybe we should be able to make antibiotics here again.
Right. And so everything that we don't know, like we can't imagine that China's going to use this against us, but like doesn't matter. We still need to have it be here. And there's a really strong argument for being able as a sovereign nation to control your own industries or have them, at least within your borders.
It's going back to traditional nation states instead of this globalist.
Right.
Or if you had to have them outside your borders, you would want them in places
a friendly country,
yes.
like Canada or UK. I mean, I have
Mexico.
But yeah, like we're countries that you're very unlikely to go to war with, right? Like
we're not currently in a war with, like China.
Well, we're not at war with China. China's at war with us.
What can I throw at you?
Well, no.
Well, that actually is a good point.
He's right. Yeah.
I thought you were going somewhere else with that. But yeah, you are right. They had war with us. We're not at war with them.
We talked a lot about this on America Covered, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, about how there were American companies manufacturing PPE. They all offshored to Mexico or China. There was only one company manufacturing surgical masks in the U.S. anymore, called Prestige Ameritech. And essentially, they had gone through this with swine flu back in, what year was that, 2014?
2008 or 9, I thought.
No, it was earlier. It was like 2009-ish.
Okay, well, it was during the Obama administration. But there was swine flu, and they basically, we ran out of surgical masks and PPE. And then, the American government and hospitals, whatever, were buying from Prestige Ameritech, and companies promised them that they would buy from them. So they, hired a bunch of people, like got all these new machines. And then after the swine flu ended, they almost went out of business because everybody went back to buying cheap masks from China.
And they were purposefully keeping the prices low.
Yeah. And so this is happening again right now. So there are companies that have started in the U.S. to manufacture N95s and surgical masks in the U.S., and they're currently being, undercut by China, dumping cheap masks, like for a few cents each, to the U.S. And it's not that they're manufactured. Yeah, it's cheaper to make a mask in China, but this is cheaper than the manufacturing price. They're actually dumping masks. So these companies are about to go out of business, these American companies. There's a company called Armbrust American that said they probably can only, they started during the pandemic to make surgical masks and N95s. And they're like, we probably can only run for another 4 months if nothing happens, if hospitals don't stop buying the Chinese masks and start buying the American masks again, if the U.S. government doesn't start, ordering from us this kind of, or protect us in some way, right? Maybe tariffs, different things. So we went through this already once, and now we got hit with the pandemic, and we're going through it again, where everybody's like, oh, well, now their cheap masks are back. Gotta buy those cheap Chinese masks. It's just insane that we went through this whole thing, and swine flu was not as bad as the coronavirus in terms of the impact it had across society, right? So we should be more aware of the problem of relying on Chinese PPE, especially, Chris, the story that you told about the Chinese government basically threatening the Trump administration.
Holding Americans hostage.
And earlier during the pandemic, they essentially stopped American companies that were manufacturing in China from bringing those masks to the U.S.
While they were still allowing international flights from Wuhan around the world, but they were blocking flights internally.
No, this is the issue where like 3M is manufacturing.
No, I'm just saying, like, while China was making sure like we couldn't get PPEs, and while they were hoarding from around the world, they were also making sure that flights from Wuhan were going internationally.
Well, I think this is already like in March, so this is already, that genie's out of the bottle.
Yeah, but the hoarding happened earlier.
Yeah, so the hoarding happened earlier, but they also stopped even in March when it was getting bad in the U.S. 3M could not export their N95s to the U.S.
American companies operating inside China.
Essentially nationalized for that period of time by the Chinese government.
So,
yeah, well, aren't you glad now that the pandemic is essentially over and we can all sort of go back to normal in our lives? And part of that is
burying our heads in the sand again?
Yeah, going back to China to do manufacturing.
Yeah, what's
Why
the problem?
not? I see no possible downside to this.
So what is the solution? The best I can come up with is time machine assassinate Rousseau.
The best I can come up with is time machine Tamagotchi.
Shelley,
it's all
up
on
to you.
Well, is there anything we can do that doesn't rely on the time machine?
Not that I can think of.
Okay.
Yeah, me neither. No, help us, Shelley.
Why
Save
do I always
America.
have to clean up the mess? Well, I think that basically, it comes down to the American people, because we already know that the elites are not going to do anything about. They have vested interests in China and with the Chinese Communist Party. They're not going to do anything about this. For them, it's about, as long as they can make money, they're not going to say, well, yeah, we should probably pull our manufacturing out of China.
It needs to be a conversation Americans are having with each other, because big tech does not like people talking about this kind of stuff. There's a reason why none of our shows are like number one on YouTube. It's impossible to find any non-mainstream media news source on YouTube anymore. So people need to, I guess, watch our things. But the main point is they need to take this information and educate themselves and talk to others about it. Because we can't rely on just people somehow understanding this.
And we need to elect officials that understand
when people
this.
When the people understand, they'll elect officials that understand.
Because, again, we can't really rely on corporate America. And, I mean, it has to be kind of a populist thing, really. Because there are many U.S. officials that are essentially bought off by the CCP, right? Like there was, what was it? The George Bush Foundation gave I forget, I'm going to have to look this up, but it was like this George Bush China Foundation gave their, lifetime achievement medals to Henry Kissinger and Dianne Feinstein. Like a month ago. I'm getting the name of the foundation wrong, but the idea is this foundation that George Bush, of course, was an ambassador to China back in the day. And then after the Tiananmen Square massacre, he sent a secret delegation to China to reassure the Chinese Communist Party that, like, don't worry, we're going to have to, we're going to have to say some bad stuff about you now, but eventually we're going to work together again.
And the sad thing about this story is, whatever this Bush Foundation is called, that should have been panned in every single media outlet.
The fact that they give this award to Kissinger and
Quislings,
Feinstein. I mean, Henry Kissinger, obviously. By the way, this last week was the 50th anniversary of Henry Kissinger's secret trip to China ahead of Nixon going there. And then, Dianne Feinstein, has been... her husband does so much business in China. She's been in bed with Chinese interests for decades in the Senate. And then, of course, there was the whole her driver was a secret Chinese spy thing. But that almost seems incidental.
It's smaller versus everything else she's done. But yeah, it's sad. Like, I mean, there's a lot of media like have great journalists doing great reporting on China. But at the end of the day, most American media is owned by one of 5 mega corporations, all of which have business ties in China. So this, we can't rely on these systems anymore. We can't just rely on the government to take care of things. We can't rely on the media to educate us. We have to do things ourselves. And people, the populists on the left and right have a lot more in common with each other than the elite.
But it's almost like the elite want people on the left and right to fight each other instead of fighting the elite.
How about that?
Huh.
For everyone listening and not watching the video, you've missed some great body language acting from Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for your sarcasm. Yeah. Well,
I think one of the clearest examples for people about how good the word of the Chinese Communist Party is good old Hong Kong. One country, 2 systems. So an American lawyer has been arrested.
Yeah, because he got involved with what looked to him like this older guy beating up a younger guy.
In 2019, this American lawyer saw this old guy just beating the crud out of a teenager. And he was like, hey, are you a police? And the guy's like, no, I'm not a police. I'm not a police. And so he intervenes. He stops this man from assaulting a teenager. Turns out the guy actually was a policeman, and now he's going to jail for assaulting a police officer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it part of that is just showing you that the police in Hong Kong can now operate with impunity. Part of it is perhaps the retroactive nature of Hong Kong laws.
Well, the laws that weren't supposed to be retroactive.
Right.
Yeah.
But they are retroactive. And I mean, I think this is something that is not true in a lot of countries, but in America it certainly is that if you commit, if you do something that it was legal at the time, but then you're arrested now but then a new law is passed that makes it illegal, you cannot be charged with that crime because at the time when you did that action, it was not a crime, right?
Like if the U.S. outlawed good looks, you'd be fine, Matt.
But I'd have to get really ugly really quick.
That's true. As soon as you carry on those good looks. Shelly, why are you so uncomfortable suddenly?
Okay, nothing.
So at any rate, American lawyer, him being a lawyer is kind of irrelevant to the story. It's just a little bit ironic because, he was someone who was probably somewhat aware of like what's allowed and what's not allowed.
Yeah. And like by assaulting this police officer, it's like when the police officer kind of lunges with a baton, he like grabs it and like holds him back. It's not like hammer fisting his nose into his skull.
Right.
So you're saying the police officer pulled kind of one of those football things where they fall on the ground and they're like, Yeah, I mean, with Hong Kong, there was a lot of talk recently in the last year about whether essentially protesters in 2019 pushed too far.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what caused the national security law to happen and this huge crackdown that's happening in Hong Kong now. But really, from the time that the UK and signed the Sino-UK joint declaration with the Chinese Communist Party, Hong Kong's fate was already written.
Because it goes back to ideology. They cannot allow one country, 2 systems. They can't allow a separate ideology.
It was a beautiful lie.
It certainly duped the Queen.
Well, and Margaret Thatcher. But it's interesting because somebody was going back and looking at Wall Street Journal articles and opinion pieces from the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially the Wall Street Journal had been saying, before the Sino-UK joint declaration was formally signed and afterwards just repeatedly going, this is a bad idea.
Screaming
this is not,
into the void.
Yeah, like this is not going to work out. The people of Hong Kong have been betrayed. Yeah.
Curse you and your sudden but inevitable betrayal.
Yes, but this is again the thing where, people just act like, China is a normal country.
It's nice to have our heads in the sand, isn't it?
And then also like this idea that, oh, well, the problem is the protesters who went too far. You're blaming the protesters. You're blaming up to 2 million people in the city who've been involved in one or more protests. You're blaming like non-violent people who didn't assault civilians. They didn't like, it's insane to start blaming protesters for something that
instead of the regime that's committing genocide is doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was a foregone, as you mentioned, Shelley, a foregone conclusion when the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed. I mean, fortunately, Hong Kong is still not quite mainland China yet. I know a lot of people in Hong Kong are kind of looking at Falun Gong as the barometer. Falun Gong, brutally persecuted in China, but allowed in Hong Kong.
I mean, harassed in Hong Kong. Like
we saw them being harassed when we were there in 2019. We saw it in 2014 even.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but, essentially legally they were allowed to be there.
Yeah, and so as long as that's still allowed, it's probably still okay in Hong Kong, right?
This authorities going after Falun Gong in Hong Kong?
Well, not yet, but basically some of these pro-Beijing lawmakers in Hong Kong, asked Hong Kong authorities to outlaw Falun Gong. So there were in this completely very spontaneous thing that happened. First of all, Hong Kong's legislature is now just like a puppet legislature because they kicked out essentially all of the pro-democracy people. And so now it's just full of pro-Beijing stooges. And a couple of them, brought up to, Chris Tang, he used to be the police commissioner. Now he's the deputy executive, chief executive.
The number two position in the
government. They were like, well, maybe the Hong Kong should outlaw Falun Gong, this, dangerous organization, subversive, whatever. And Chris Tang was like, well, there have been 3,400 some police investigations or some kind of police actions related to Falun Gong. So, we will investigate them according to law. Or he was a little non-committal about it.
But it's like those investigations were basically like police going after some like, auntie in a yellow shirt holding up a sign about, China's organ harvesting, right? Like it's not like incidents that Falun Gong committed. It's the police taking action against
and we don't know
innocent
There's
people.
Also a lot of, because we were talking about Falun Gong getting harassed in Hong Kong, there was this basically anti-Falun Gong organization in Hong Kong that was
backed by the Chinese Communist Party's United Front work department
to basically just harass Falun Gong people when they were trying to pass out, flyers about human rights or whatever. They would set up right next to them and try to film them and try to harass people who talk to Falun Gong people. So it was a lot of these incidents probably relate to that kind of stuff too. But anyway, so this is the first indication that, they probably will at some point go after Falun Gong.
And so then what will that mean? Does that mean labor camps in Hong Kong, detention centers, organ harvesting?
I mean, I think that it definitely means, if they actually outlaw Falun Gong, that means that you can't practice it publicly anymore. Right.
And if you go protest something related to what the Communist Party is doing to Falun Gong, then you could be undermining national security. Right. So you could actually be charged with that. And under the national security law, they can also extradite people to mainland China. Right. So theoretically, a Hong Kong Falun Gong practitioner exercising their free speech in Hong Kong can get arrested, charged, and even potentially extradited to mainland China to face punishment.
I wouldn't even be surprised if that starts to apply to any Falun Gong practitioner in the world that travels to Hong Kong.
I mean, I think probably now is not the time to go to Hong Kong.
No, for anyone.
Really.
No.
Right.
But it's a little tricky because this is basically, if you use the national security law, you're using a communist law in a Hong Kong system that previously had a totally different judicial system. So we don't really know exactly what that will look like, I think.
Yeah.
But essentially, I think it's a sign that they're just going to go after anyone. That Hong Kong will not just be another mainland Chinese city, but it will be a mainland Chinese city that is considered a problem city. Like
It'll be more like Xinjiang
Xinjiang,
than
yeah.
Shanghai.
Yeah.
And Hong Kong is a victim of the Western world not understanding this ideological war the Chinese Communist Party has been waging. If the West had been strong, that would have been deterrence to stop the Chinese Communist Party from doing that. If Great Britain hadn't even give up.
We'd have to go back to the 80s, I think, because once they gave up the administration of
Shelley,
Hong Kong.
We'd have to go back to Rousseau.
Once they gave up the administration of Hong Kong to the Chinese Communist Party, there was this is the problem with the Sino-British Joint Declaration. There's no enforcement mechanism, right? So
if you violate it,
well, whatever. Yeah.
But they promised not to violate it.
Yeah. So that worked out great. But, we're going to see essentially the Great Firewall in Hong Kong.
Yep.
We're going to see either some type of, and this is not maybe very soon, but there are going to be things like, detention center camp kind of things for ideological crimes against the Chinese Communist Party, either in Hong Kong or you're going to be shipped to China.
Mm-hmm.
All of the stuff that comes with CCP rule is going to be in Hong Kong. The surveillance is coming, like everything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we shouldn't pretend to ourselves that Hong Kong will be different because it's Hong Kong and they still have this one country, two systems. It's going to be all of the horrible authoritarian things. And some of them may appear to take on different forms, like because the legal system is different in terms of how it's structured. But fundamentally, it's all communist now, as the sort of communist ideology infiltrates. Because you can't have, once the legal system is compromised by like a communist power, then the only thing that's different from mainland China is the form, right? But fundamentally, it's going to be exactly the same thing. So yeah, like everything, pro-democracy people, dissidents, religious people, including Falun Gong, Tibetan protesters, rights lawyers.
I hope there aren't any Uyghurs in Hong Kong.
Yeah. So like all of the groups are eventually going to be persecuted in Hong Kong because the Communist Party considers Hong Kong China.
And that is exactly what is in store for Taiwan if the U.S. fails to defend it.
No. Taiwan will be different because there'll be one country, two systems, and it'll be a separate system, Chris.
Now imagine this regime being the dominant superpower. That's what we have to fight.
The average between a liberal democracy and authoritarianism, if you try to find the average, it's authoritarianism.
I don't understand that.
It's all authoritarianism until you get to like a government that restricts its own power and it restricts its own ability to go after people. And there's only a small handful of countries that actually do that, right? Like maybe 1 in 10 countries, at most 1 in 20 countries has meaningful limits on its own power. Like most countries are authoritarian, right? And so like as soon as you start having the Chinese Communist Party like grow in terms of its superpowers, ability to be involved in the financial systems and dominate trade with more and more countries, like it's going to seep into everything. And countries that are that still kind of have their own systems are going to have those systems increasingly infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party.
That is a great point. The future, if we do not stop the Chinese Communist Party now, the United States of America will become more authoritarian.
Right. We see tiny little pieces of this happening now, and we don't recognize it. But like a good example is what you mentioned on Friday on China Uncensored, Chris, is Anne-Marie Brady is a New Zealand professor who made a comment on Twitter making fun of Chinese leader Xi
It was
Jinping.
quite mild.
Very mild. And then Twitter briefly suspended her account.
It wasn't suspended. It was restricted.
It was restricted. So Twitter took an action, right? Which is the kind of action the Communist Party would have wanted. I'm not saying they took instructions from the party, but like this little thing that's an American company restricting free speech because they think that's what China would want, even without a specific instruction.
With Twitter, it's quite possible what happened was that like a lot of like pro CCP people reported.
It doesn't matter.
No. I'm just saying then basically it's a way of gaming Twitter's mechanism, right? It's like a way of gaming the system so that like, it automatically restricts this,
Yes.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that like the
U.S. will become more authoritarian.
Right. And you'll see little bits and pieces filtering through the system that we've established, like through the American mechanisms, right? Like the American mechanism of speech is not going to the Times Square and shouting. I mean, some people still do that, but those are typically crazy people. The way that people have speech now is through platforms that are owned by some company,
Big
right?
tech.
And we will start to increasingly see, if we're not careful, the sort of the Chinese Communist Party's influence filter through these tech companies.
I mean, we already are seeing that. I'm not saying the tech companies are doing it. This is why I wanted to make clear what probably happened with Twitter, because you don't even need the companies themselves to be like, oh, we're going to listen to the CCP. The CCP finds ways to use that against you, right? For example, on YouTube, this whole sudden flood of Xinjiang genocide denialism from YouTubers in China, right? And Serpent did a video on this recently where he showed that a lot of these YouTubers were all obviously taken on the same trip to Xinjiang, because if you watch their videos, they kind of show up in each other's shots accidentally in the backgrounds, because they're all kind of like, it looks like they're all kind of outside like some main gate in I forget where this is, Urumqi, somewhere in Xinjiang, and they're kind of dancing with these Uyghurs who are very happy and totally not being genocided. And so this is a way that even without YouTube specifically going in and being like, well, we're going to restrict,
this is what's happening now.
Mm-hmm.
In a future where the Chinese Communist Party has won its ideological war, where it's able to invade Taiwan without repercussion, I think we'll be seeing a lot more than what we're seeing right now in the United States.
Yeah, and like it'll kind of become the way it is in China, where everything is a political statement, and you always kind of have to watch yourself. I was thinking about one of the videos we showed in today's China Uncensored episode about the Vitasoy thing, where this Hong Kong company, Vitasoy, drink maker, they got in trouble. They got boycotted in China, right? And there was this just Chinese live streamer who happened to be drinking the carton of Vitasoy brand lemonade on camera. And then people were like, stop drinking that on camera. And he was like, what did something happen? He didn't know. And then people had to kind of telegraph to him that it had to do with the Hong Kong thing, like Hong Kong issues, without even using the words Hong Kong. There's a shorthand way to say it without using the words, because that would get censored. So, this guy is just drinking a drink on camera, and that's accidentally a huge political statement, right?
Right. And just like the way the political winds shift so quickly, like what's happened with Vitasoy is 6 months from now, like no one's going to remember this. It'll be a non-issue, and probably Vitasoy could be back on shelves in China. But like now it's like this huge sin that you're getting canceled over. So, but like this is the same. I remember when you mentioned Serpent ZA, and when he was on our podcast, he was talking about how when he was in China, there was like briefly this political wind that shifted against Apple, and everyone had to throw away their iPhones, right, and waste like all their money that they'd spent on their iPhones. But that's because like iPhone was like Apple was not okay. But like everyone has iPhones again now, so it doesn't matter, right? So it has nothing to do with the product. It has nothing to do with any like concrete thing. It's just the political winds. And yes, we will start to see that increasingly in the US. The degree to which we're seeing this kind of stuff in the rest of the world is correlated, step by step with how much power the Chinese Communist Party has. So the trick is to not let the Chinese Communist Party get any more power.
And so that is up to us. We have to educate ourselves, and in particular, people need to educate themselves about communism and what communism's true nature is, and be able to see the logical fallacies of their arguments and when this sort of communist ideology comes up in other places. Either that, or Time Machine to kill Rousseau.
Or Time Machine to get Tamagotchis, distribute them to all the Communist Party officials so they get so distracted by Tamagotchis that they don't bother to take over Hong Kong or the rest of the world. Okay,
you just might
solved.
be on to something.
I think I am.
Technically, it doesn't even require time travel since Tamagotchi exists now.
As an app on your phone.
I mean, it's kind of already too late for Hong Kong. So you'd have to go back to the 90s, get the Tamagotchis, then go back to the 80s and give one to Deng Xiaoping.
No, because then they'd have super technology. Imagine what China could have done if they had Tamagotchi technology a decade before the West. It's game over.
Game over, Shelley. No, you got to do it my way.
Which is what again?
Yeah, go back to the 90s, get a bunch of Tamagotchis, give them to all the party officials so that they're distracted and they don't bother to try to take over Hong Kong. And we're good to go.
But they've already taken over Hong Kong.
Well, early 90s. Okay, actually, you know what? I don't like what you're doing right now, because you're basically finding holes in my argument, which I personally feel is like a personal attack on me.
Also, the effort into exposing logical fallacies of a time travel Tamagotchi plan.
Yeah,
it's beneath you, Shelley.
Yeah, there's also obviously the issue of when you travel into the past and then you go back to the future. Which future are you going to? Right.
That's true.
Well, that's Back to the Future rules.
Well, do you have branching futures, or do you have one single future that has to unify based on what was done in the past? So there's a lot of complications that we haven't addressed.
And thank you for joining us for this kind of hard-hitting China analysis that you can't get anywhere else.
Hey, I love talking about time travel stuff.
Save it for the video game channel.
Okay.
Or the history channel.
Is there a time travel video game?
Yes. Many games have you travel through time.
Yeah. What about Zelda Ocarina of Time? And N64. That was I'm not old. Anyway.
Thank you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jung.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And we'll talk to you next time. Unless somebody assassinates Rousseau, in which case everything will be different. See you next time.